On the cool morning of September 23rd, 2023, George Hartley, a 72-year-old millionaire from Boston, Massachusetts, stood at the panoramic window of his spacious office on the 52nd floor of the Prudential Center skyscraper. His gaze was fixed on the city below, but his thoughts wandered far beyond the familiar streets and buildings. George ran a hand through his gray hair, neatly tucked back, and adjusted the tie on his impeccably tailored Brioni suit. His reflection in the glass spoke of a man who had achieved everything one could dream of in life, but his eyes betrayed a deep concern. Founder and CEO of Hartley Innovations, a company specializing in the development of environmentally friendly technologies, George felt insecure for the first time in years. His fortune, estimated at $1,300,000,000, was about to pass to his heirs, but to whom exactly? It was a question that had plagued him for the past few weeks. George turned away from the window and walked slowly to his massive oak desk, noting with his eyes the details he had so carefully selected. The paintings by contemporary American artists on the walls, the Henry Moore sculpture in the corner, the antique Patek Philippe clock on the mantelpiece. Each piece was not just a piece of jewelry, but a reflection of his life's journey, his accomplishments and values. Sinking into a leather armchair, George opened a desk drawer and pulled out 3 silver-framed photographs. The smiling faces of his children stared back at him. Oldest son Michael, 45, a successful Wall Street investment banker. Middle daughter Sarah, 39, a prominent human rights attorney. And youngest son David, 32, an aspiring technology entrepreneur. George sighed, remembering how, not so long ago, he had been confident in his decision to divide the inheritance equally among the children. But the closer his 73rd birthday approached, the date he himself had set to officially announce his decision, the more his doubts overwhelmed him. "Mr. Hartley," the secretary's voice interrupted his musings over the intercom, "Detective Lisa Rodriguez has arrived for a meeting." George straightened in his chair, instantly switching into business communication mode. "Send her in, Janet," he replied, tucking the photos back into the drawer. A few seconds later, the door opened and Lisa Rodriguez entered the office. A 40-year-old woman with a shrewd eye and a confident gait, she was known in certain circles as one of Boston's top private investigators. "Mr. Hartley," she began, shaking hands with the millionaire, "I have received your unusual proposal. Are you sure you wish to proceed?" George gestured for her to sit down and lowered himself into the chair opposite. "Yes, Miss Rodriguez. I realize that my request may seem unconventional, but I assure you, I have good reasons." Lisa looked at him carefully, tilting her head slightly. "You want me to investigate your own children? It's a rather delicate situation." George nodded, his face remaining impenetrable, but his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of the chair gave away his inner tension. "I understand how this sounds, Miss Rodriguez, but this isn't just about my personal condition. Hartley Innovations is a company that could change the future of energy in our country. I need to make sure my inheritance and my company gets into the right hands." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that, but why now? You seem quite healthy, Mr. Hartley." George smiled weakly. "Health can be deceptive, Miss Rodriguez, but that's not the point. In 3 weeks I shall be 73 years old. I made a promise to myself to make a final decision on the future of the company and the distribution of the inheritance by that day. But the closer that date gets, the more doubts I have." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "You know, when I started my business, I had nothing but an idea and perseverance. I worked days and nights, risked everything, and this is the result." He circled the panorama of Boston with his hand. "But I never forgot where I came from. All my life I've tried not only to make money, but to make a difference in the world. Hartley Innovations isn't just a business, it's my legacy, my contribution to the future. Lisa listened intently, noting the passion in George's voice. And you want to make sure your children share those values? George turned to her. Exactly. I love my children, Miss Rodriguez. But love shouldn't be blinding. I need to know who they really are when they think their father isn't looking. How do they conduct their affairs? How do they treat people? What are their true motives and ambitions? He walked back to his chair and sat down, leaning forward. I want you to conduct a thorough but sensitive investigation. No one must know you are working for me. I need a complete picture of their lives, professional and personal. Lisa thought for a moment. That's a difficult task, Mr. Hartley, especially given your children's situation. A Wall Street banker, a prominent lawyer, a technology entrepreneur. They're probably well protective of their privacy. George nodded. I understand. That's why I approached you. Your reputation speaks for itself. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Lisa leaned back in her chair, mulling over the proposal. Very well, Mr. Hartley. I'll take the case, but I have a condition. If I discover anything illegal or unethical during my investigation, I will be obliged to report it to the proper authorities. George held out his hand without hesitation. I completely agree, Miss Rodriguez. What's more, I insist on it. If any of my children are involved in anything illegal, I want to know about it first. They shook hands, sealing the agreement. Lisa stood up, preparing to leave. I'll start work immediately. You'll get your first report in a week. When the detective left, George turned to the window again. The sun had already risen high, painting the skyscrapers of Boston in golden tones. He thought of his children, of the company, of the legacy he would leave behind. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped that his fears were in vain, that his children would prove worthy successors. But another part of him, the part that had made him a successful businessman, reminded him that hope was a bad counselor when it came to billions of dollars and the future of a company that could change the world. George sighed and returned to his desk. He had a lot of work ahead of him. While Lisa Rodriguez would be conducting her investigation, he had to prepare the company for possible changes. Opening his laptop, he began looking at Hartley Innovations' financial statements for the last quarter. The numbers were impressive. Not only did the company remain a leader in the development of clean technology, but it was showing steady growth even in an unstable economy. The latest project, the development of a revolutionary solar energy storage system, had caught the attention of the world's largest energy companies. George leaned back in his chair, remembering how Hartley Innovations had been a small startup just 15 years ago, huddled in a rented office in the suburbs of Boston. At the time, few people believed that a successful business could be built on green technologies. But George saw the future and was willing to risk everything for his dream. He remembered the nights spent working, the endless meetings with investors, the rejections and disappointments. He remembered how his wife Elizabeth had supported him all these years, believing in him even when he himself was beginning to doubt. Her passing 5 years ago had been the hardest blow of his life. George's thoughts returned to his children. He remembered how little Michael had looked at his drawings with a serious look, how Sarah had always stood up for the weak at school, how David had spent hours on the computer creating his first programs. As they grew up, George hoped that at least one of them would share his passion for innovation and environmental technology, but each turned out to have a different path. Michael chose the world of finance, quickly rising through the ranks on Wall Street. Sarah devoted herself to the defense of human rights, becoming a famous lawyer. And David, although he went into technology, his startup was far from being environmentally oriented. George couldn't say he was disappointed in his children. Each of them had been successful in their respective fields. But now that it was time to think about the future of the company, he couldn't escape the thought that perhaps none of them were ready to take responsibility for his brainchild. An intercom call snapped George out of his musings. "Mr. Hartley," came Janet's voice, "your daughter Sarah is on the line. She says it's urgent." George frowned. Sarah rarely called his office, especially in the middle of the day. "Put her through, Janet," he answered, feeling the muscles in his neck tense. "Dad?" Sarah's voice sounded agitated. "Are you sitting up? I have news." George straightened up in his chair. "What's wrong, dear?" "I won the case, Daddy. The very one I've been working on for the last 2 years. The Supreme Court just ruled in our favor." George felt his face spread into a smile. "Sarah, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you, honey." "Thank you, Daddy." Sarah could hear the relief and joy in his voice. "It means that thousands of people will finally be compensated for environmental damage. It will change their lives." George listened as his daughter excitedly recounted the details of the case, the long months of preparation, the intense court hearings. His heart filled with pride. Sarah had always been a fighter for justice, and now she had achieved such a significant success. "We should celebrate," George said when Sarah had finished her story. "What do you say we have a family dinner this Friday? I'll invite Michael and David." "That sounds great, Dad. I'd love to come. It's been a long time since we've all gotten together." After the conversation ended, George sat for a while longer, smiling at his thoughts. Perhaps he had judged his children too harshly. Maybe they had inherited his desire to make a difference in the world after all. It was just that they had each chosen their own path. But immediately, another thought made him frown. It was one thing to be successful in one's own field, and quite another to be ready to take responsibility for a huge corporation, on whose decisions thousands of jobs and the future of environmental technology depended. George sighed and turned back to the window. The sun was already sinking, coloring the Boston sky a subtle orange. He thought about the upcoming family dinner. It would be a good opportunity to observe the children, maybe even probe the ground regarding their interest in the company. But at the same time, he couldn't escape the guilt. Here he was, sitting here in his luxurious office, making plans to check up on his own children. The children he loves more than anything in the world. Is he doing the right thing? George shook his head, pushing the doubt away. No, he's not doing this out of mistrust or suspicion. He's doing it for the future of his family, his company, and, in a sense, the future of the entire planet. Hartley Innovations wasn't just a business. It was his legacy, his contribution to solving global problems. He couldn't risk it all, not even for his children. With a determined nod to his thoughts, George returned to his desk. He needed to prepare for the upcoming dinner as well as consider how he would proceed after receiving the first report from Detective Rodriguez. The future was uncertain, but one thing George knew for sure was that whatever decision he ultimately made would change his family's life forever. And with that thought in mind, he plunged into his work, preparing for the coming events and inevitable changes. George Hartley's decision to hire a private investigator to check up on his own children was not spontaneous or ill-considered. It was the result of months of observation, reflection, and growing anxiety about the future of his life's work, Hartley Innovations. It all began about a year before the events described on George's 72nd birthday. Traditionally, the Hartley family gathered at a luxurious restaurant in downtown Boston to celebrate the occasion. Michael, Sarah, and David had flown in from out of town to spend the evening with their father. The dinner began as usual, with congratulations, gifts, and informal conversations about each of the children's lives. Michael talked about his successes on Wall Street, about a big deal he had recently made. Sarah shared details of her latest high-profile case to protect workers' rights at a large factory. David spoke enthusiastically about the progress of a new app for his startup. George listened to them with pride, but somewhere in the back of his mind he felt a slight disappointment. None of his children had shown any interest in Hartley Innovations, the kind of technology that could make a difference in the world. They were successful, yes, but each in a different field, far removed from what George had dedicated his life to. Near the end of the evening, the conversation turned to the future. George shared his plans to expand the company, a new project to develop a revolutionary solar energy storage system. "That's amazing, Dad," Sarah said with a smile. "You were always ahead of your time." Michael nodded. "Yeah, it sounds promising. I'm sure investors will be thrilled." And David added, "Maybe you should think about partnering with some big technology company. It might speed up the development and implementation process." George watched his children carefully, trying to catch in their eyes even a spark of the enthusiasm he himself felt when talking about his project. But instead he saw only polite interest and perhaps a slight impatience, as if they had already mentally turned their attention to their own concerns and plans. It was then, in that moment, that George first really thought about the future of Hartley Innovations after he stepped aside. Who would continue his work? Who would fight as passionately for clean technology, for a better future for the planet? In the months that followed, these thoughts kept George on his toes. He began to observe his children more closely, analyzing their actions, decisions, life priorities. Michael, his eldest son, had always been ambitious and determined. He quickly rose through the ranks on Wall Street, becoming one of the youngest partners in his firm. But the methods by which he succeeded sometimes made George uneasy. Michael seemed willing to do anything for profit and status. One day, George overheard Michael on the phone discussing a deal that could bring huge profits, but involved a company known for its disregard for environmental regulations. This made George wonder, would Michael be able to maintain the ethical principles of Hartley Innovations if he inherited the company? Sarah, the middle daughter, has always been George's pride. Her work as a human rights lawyer commanded his deep respect. But lately, he had begun to see signs of weariness and frustration in her eyes. At a family dinner a few months ago, Sarah admitted that she was thinking about a career change. "Sometimes I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall," she said at the time. "Maybe I could do better if I worked in corporate law." Those words made George wonder. Had Sarah lost the passion for fighting for justice that had always so enraptured him? And if so, could she find a new passion in the leadership of Hartley Innovations? David, the youngest, has always been George's favorite, though he has never openly admitted it. His interest in technology, his innovative thinking, all reminded George of himself as a young man. But lately, David seemed more preoccupied with creating apps that could quickly attract attention and generate revenue than developing technology that could really make a difference in the world. His latest project, an instant messaging app with augmented reality, was undoubtedly innovative, but far from the goals to which George had dedicated his life. All these observations and thoughts gradually accumulated, creating a heavy weight of doubt and anxiety in George's soul. He loved his children, was proud of their accomplishments, but could not escape the thought that none of them were ready to truly take responsibility for his life's work. The turning point came 3 months before George's 73rd birthday. He took his children on a tour of the new Hartley Innovations Research Center. It was a grand project in which George had invested not only a huge amount of money, but his entire soul. He hoped that the sight of advanced laboratories, familiarity with revolutionary projects will ignite in the eyes of his children the same fire that burned in himself. But the reaction of the children was far from his expectations. Michael spent most of the tour answering work calls and texts. Sarah, though politely interested, seemed distracted and tired, and David, though impressed with the technology, kept trying to turn the conversation to how the developments could be monetized in the short term. At the end of the day, when the kids left, George was alone in his office, looking out at Boston at night through the panoramic window. It was then that he made the decision that led to his meeting with Detective Lisa Rodriguez. George realized he couldn't just pass the company on to his children based on family ties alone. Hartley Innovations wasn't just a business. It was his legacy, his contribution to the future of the planet. He couldn't risk it all without making sure his successor truly shared his values and vision. But how do we know which of his children, if any at all, are truly ready to take on this responsibility? How do we understand their true motives, their character, their ability to make difficult decisions when not just profits are at stake, but the well-being of thousands of people and the future of environmental technology? George realized that his children had long since grown up and were living their own lives. He couldn't just ask them directly. He knew he would only get the answers they thought were right. He needed an objective, unbiased assessment of their lives, their decisions, their true values. That's why he decided to enlist the services of a private investigator. It wasn't an easy decision, and George felt guilty for essentially spying on his own children. But he convinced himself that he wasn't doing it out of mistrust or suspicion, but out of a deep concern for the future of his family, his company, and ultimately the future of the planet. George hoped that the results of the investigation would dispel his doubts. Maybe he would discover that his children were far more mature and responsible than he had thought. Maybe he would see in them qualities of leadership and visionary that he hadn't noticed before. But at the same time, he was preparing for the possibility that his fears would be confirmed. What then? Would he be able to find the strength to hand the company over to someone outside the family, knowing it would break his children's hearts? Or maybe he would have to stay at the helm of the company longer than he had planned, hoping that in time, one of his children would show the necessary qualities. All these thoughts and doubts led George Hartley to Detective Lisa Rodriguez's office. He knew that the decision he made could change his family's future forever. But he also knew he couldn't afford to act blindly when so much was at stake. Now, sitting in his office after his meeting with Rodriguez, George felt a mixture of determination and anxiety. He had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. All he could do was wait for the results of the investigation and hope that whatever his final decision was, it would be the right one. For his children, for the company, and for the world, he was so eager to change for the better. Lisa Rodriguez sat at her desk, scrutinizing the 3 folders in front of her. Each folder contained the results of a 2-week investigation into the lives of George Hartley's children. She knew that the information she had gathered could change the fate of an entire family and a multi-billion-dollar company. The investigation of Michael, George's oldest son, began on Wall Street. Lisa spent several days watching him work from afar and talking to his co-workers under the guise of a potential client. Michael, as it turned out, had a reputation as a ruthless but efficient investment banker. His colleagues described him as someone who always gets his way, but some hinted at ethically questionable methods. Lisa learned of Michael's recent deal that had made his firm a huge profit. Digging deeper, she discovered that the deal involved a company known for violating environmental regulations. Michael was aware of this, but seems to have ignored this information for financial gain. However, it would be unfair to present Michael only in a negative light. Lisa also discovered that he regularly donated substantial sums to charity, including environmental projects. Admittedly, these donations often coincided with periods when his firm needed positive PR. In his personal life, Michael proved to be a devoted husband and father. Despite his busy schedule, he tried to spend weekends with his family, often organizing camping trips to the countryside. This showed Lisa that somewhere deep inside, Michael still had the love of nature instilled in him by his father as a child. Sarah's investigation proved to be the most challenging for Lisa. As an experienced human rights attorney, Sarah was careful and attentive to detail. Lisa began by researching Sarah's recent cases. She found that Sarah had indeed made impressive strides in defending workers' rights and fighting corporate misconduct. However, Sarah's most recent case, involving a large technology company accused of labor law violations, was suddenly settled out of court on terms that many considered too lenient for the corporation. Intrigued by this, Lisa began to dig deeper. She discovered that shortly before the settlement, Sarah had met with the CEO of that company. Officially, it was a meeting to discuss the terms of the settlement, but Lisa learned from an informant inside the company that the CEO had offered Sarah a high-paying position in the corporation's legal department. Sarah didn't accept the offer immediately, but according to co-workers, she was beginning to show signs of professional burnout. Lisa overheard Sarah talking to a friend at a coffee shop, where she talked about her frustration with the system and that maybe it's time to think about herself. However, Lisa also discovered that Sarah continued to work on low-income client cases, often staying in the office late into the night. This showed that, despite her doubts, her passion for justice had not completely faded. Investigating David, her youngest son, led Lisa into the world of tech startups. She spent several days talking to employees and investors of David's company under the guise of a potential partner. David proved to be a charismatic leader capable of inspiring his team. His latest project, an augmented reality messaging app, was generating a lot of interest from investors. However, Lisa discovered that David's original idea was much more ambitious. He originally planned to create a platform that could use AR for educational purposes, including raising awareness of environmental issues. But after several meetings with investors, the project evolved into a more commercially attractive but less socially relevant app. Lisa also learned that David was in talks to sell his company to a large technology corporation. This corporation was known for its aggressive approach to collecting user data, which was contrary to David's original ethical principles. At the same time, Lisa discovered that David was secretly working on a side project, an app to track and minimize his personal carbon footprint. He hadn't told investors about it for fear they would find the project unprofitable. Sitting at her desk, Lisa Rodriguez tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Each of George Hartley's children proved to be complex, multifaceted individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses. Michael certainly possessed the business acumen and ambition necessary to run a large corporation, but his willingness to ignore ethical considerations for the sake of profit was troubling. Would he be able to maintain Hartley Innovation's commitment to environmental values when it conflicted with financial interests? Sarah seemed to be closest to George's ethical principles. Her devotion to justice and human rights was evident. However, signs of professional burnout and the lure of a more comfortable corporate career raised questions about her long-term commitment to these ideals. David may have had the greatest potential to continue his father's innovative legacy. His technical expertise and understanding of current trends could have taken Hartley Innovations to the next level. But his willingness to give up more meaningful projects for commercial success raised doubts about his ability to maintain the company's long-term vision. Lisa realized that her report could have serious implications for the Hartley family and for the future of Hartley Innovations. She decided to include not only the facts, but also her observations about the potential of each of the children. For Michael, she recommended an ethical leadership program that could help him balance financial success with social responsibility. For Sarah, she suggested a short sabbatical and a mentorship program with successful leaders in corporate social responsibility. This could help her see how her skills and passion for justice could be applied in the corporate world without compromising her values. For David, she recommended working more closely with his father, perhaps through a special innovation project at Hartley Innovations. This could help him see how his technical skills could be applied to solving global problems, not just creating commercially successful applications. Finishing her report, Lisa realized that the final decision would rest with George Hartley, but she hoped that her investigation would help him see not only the flaws, but also the potential in each of his children. After all, Lisa thought, perhaps the future of Hartley Innovations lay not in choosing one successor, but in combining the strengths of all three children. Michael could provide financial stability and growth, Sarah could provide ethical leadership and social responsibility, and David could provide technological innovation. With that thought in mind, Lisa closed the folders and began to prepare for her meeting with George Hartley. She knew that the information she had gathered could change the future of not only the Hartley family, but the entire company, and possibly the future of environmental technology as a whole. George Hartley sat in his home office, looking at the folder containing Detective Lisa Rodriguez's report. He had spent a sleepless night rereading the document over and over again, trying to make sense of the information about his children. Every word seemed to be imbued with bitter truth and broke his heart. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in," George said in a hoarse voice. Alice, his longtime housekeeper, entered the room. "Mr. Hartley, your children have arrived. They're waiting for you in the parlor." George nodded. "Thank you, Alice. I'll be right down." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This conversation would not be easy, but necessary. Walking down to the living room, George saw his children. Michael was pacing nervously around the room. Sarah was sitting on the couch, rubbing the edge of her scarf, and David was standing at the window looking out at the garden. "Thank you for coming," George began. His children turned to him, their faces expressing a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Daddy, what's going on?" Sarah asked. "Your message sounded serious." George sat down in his favorite chair and gestured for the children to sit down. "I have something important to tell you, and I'm afraid you won't like it." He paused, gathering his wits. "I've hired a private investigator to watch you for the past few weeks." A heavy silence hung in the room. Michael was the first to break the silence. "Have you been spying on us?" His voice shook with barely contained anger. "Dad, how could you?" Sarah looked shocked and hurt. David just stared at his father with wide-open eyes, not saying a word. George held up his hand, asking them to listen. "I know this sounds awful, and I understand your outrage, but please let me explain." He told them of his doubts, of his worry for the future of the company, of how important it was to him to make sure his legacy fell into safe hands. "But why didn't you just talk to us?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with resentment. "Because I was afraid you'd tell me what I wanted to hear instead of the truth," George answered honestly. Michael jumped up from his seat. "And what did you find out, Dad? That we're not good enough for your precious company?" George looked at his oldest son. "I learned that you're a brilliant financier, Michael, but I've also learned about the deals you've made that ignore ethical concerns." Michael turned pale. "This is business, Dad. Sometimes you have to make compromises." "What about compromising your own conscience?" George asked quietly. He turned to Sarah. "Darling, I've always admired your fight for justice, but I've also learned about your doubts, about what you're thinking about changing careers." Sarah lowered her eyes. I'm just tired, Dad. Sometimes it seems like nothing changes no matter how hard we try." Finally, George looked at David. "And you, son, your talent and innovative thinking are impressive. But why did you abandon your original idea of an educational platform in favor of a more commercial project?" David looked ashamed. "The investors said it wouldn't make a quick profit. I thought maybe I could revisit the idea later." George sighed. "I realize that each of you has followed your own path, and I'm proud of your accomplishments. but I also see that you've all lost sight, to some extent, of the values I've tried to instill in you." "So now what?" Michael asked. "You're going to disinherit us?" George shook his head. "No, Michael. I'm going to offer you a chance to remember who you are and what really matters." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the garden he had once planted with his children. "I want each of you to spend a month working on a special project at Hartley Innovations. Michael, I want you to develop an ethical investment strategy for the company. Sarah, I want you to lead a new corporate social responsibility initiative. And you, David, I want you to revisit your idea for an educational platform and develop a prototype." The kids glanced around, not knowing what to say. "I'm not asking you to give up your careers or change your entire lives," George continued. "I'm only asking you for 1 month. Give yourself a chance to see how your talents and skills can be applied to something greater." Silence hung in the room. Each of the children was immersed in their own thoughts, mulling over their father's words. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Dad, I don't know what to say. What you did is hurtful and wrong, but I understand why you did it. And maybe you're right. Maybe I do need to remember why I started practicing law in the first place." Michael still looked angry, but there was a thoughtful expression in his eyes. "I can't promise that I'll change my whole approach to business, but I'm willing to try your suggestion, Dad." David looked up, a familiar light of enthusiasm gleaming in his eyes. "You know, Dad, I've always wanted to revisit that idea. Maybe this is my chance." George felt the tension that had been stiffening his chest for the last few weeks begin to let go. "Thank you. I know I betrayed your trust and it will take me a while to regain it, but I hope this month will be the beginning of something new for all of us." He walked over to each of his children, hugging them. "I love you all, and no matter what happens, you will always be my children. But I also hope that you can become something more, partners in the cause to which I've dedicated my life." When the children left, each immersed in his own thoughts, George returned to his office. He knew there were many challenges ahead. Trust, once shattered, would not be easily rebuilt. But he also felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the future of Hartley Innovations would not be what he had envisioned, but maybe it would be even better, with 3 unique individuals united by a common purpose. George sat down at his desk and began writing a plan for the coming month. He knew it would be a challenging time for all of them, but also a time of opportunity, a time of growth, and perhaps a time of healing. A year later, George Hartley stood on stage in the main conference room of Hartley Innovations, preparing for the most important announcement of his career. The room was full of employees, journalists, and company partners. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice firm but his eyes read excitement. "Today I am announcing a new era for Hartley Innovations." He paused, looking around the audience. "As of today, the management of the company will be taken over by a new board of directors, which will include my children, Michael, Sarah, and David Hartley." A surprised whisper swept through the auditorium. George continued, "They will each make unique contributions to the future of our company. Michael will be responsible for financial strategy, with a particular focus on ethical investing. Sarah will lead the new corporate social responsibility division, and David will lead innovation, including our new education platform." George invited his children to the stage. They came out looking confident and determined. "The past year has been challenging for our family," George admitted honestly. "We went through trials and doubts, but these challenges have made us stronger and helped us realize what's really important." Michael stepped forward. "We've learned that success in business doesn't have to conflict with ethical principles. Our new investment strategy will prove that it's possible to be profitable and responsible at the same time." Sarah continued, "We have realized that real change starts from within, Our corporate responsibility program isn't just words, it's a commitment to society and the planet. David concluded, and we realize that innovation only makes sense when it serves a higher purpose. Our new education platform will make environmental education accessible to millions. George looked proudly at his children. I'm putting Hartley Innovations in good hands, hands that will not only run the company but shape a better future for all of us. Applause filled the auditorium. George hugged each of his children, feeling his eyes fill with tears. He knew there were many challenges ahead, but he was now confident. Together they could overcome any difficulties. As he left the hall, George noticed Lisa Rodriguez among the reporters. She nodded to him with a slight smile. George responded with a grateful nod, realizing that her work a year ago had been the catalyst for all these changes. The future now seemed bright and full of possibilities. Hartley Innovations was ready to not just continue on its path, but to take it to the next level by combining financial success, social responsibility, and technological innovation. And George knew his legacy was in good hands, the hands of his children who had finally found their way to what really mattered.